Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are having a bit of a mix-up from what I've been doing recently on the channel. Usually, for the past couple of weeks, I've been going in-depth into what I think each lottery team should do with their first-round pick. However, today I thought that I'd mix it up a little bit. We've made it all the way through the lottery, so I'll take a break from the individual team stuff. And today, I am going to get into my big board where I list off my top 30 players in this year's NBA draft. I have it tiered. These top 30 guys are broken into 6 tiers, and all of this is in my opinion. However, I think that players can be moved throughout the tiers. So let's say you have the first pick. There's 2 guys in my top tier, so I would be okay if you took the guy I have first or the guy I have second. If you have the 8th pick, I have 4 guys in my third tier, and or 5 guys in my third tier. I could see you taking any one of those 5 guys. If you have the 28th pick, I have 7 guys listed in my 6th tier, but really that could probably expand all the way down to like 35. So I'd be okay with you taking any of those guys there. So that's how this is going to work. Before I get into it, though, I just want to leave a reminder to leave a like and subscribe. These videos have been doing great recently, these draft videos, and I'm so thankful to have all these people watching me talk about basketball. It's kind of why I started this, but why not subscribe? It'll do me a favor because obviously I'll gain a subscriber, and it'll do you a favor because you'll have all this new access to some fantastic basketball content. So without further ado, let's get right into my big board as of November 6th. So, at number 1, I have LaMelo Ball. We've heard that he's had some questionable meetings with teams recently, but I don't know. I don't have too many questions about this guy. I don't think that he is a Zion or a Luka or who was it the year before? Markelle Fultz, but obviously Jason Tatum was the top guy in that draft. I don't think he's on the same level as any of those guys. But I do think that LaMelo is going to be a very solid NBA player. I think that he will probably make an all-star team at some point in his career. He's a fantastic playmaker, probably the best playmaker we've seen since Luka. He's got some defensive potential, got some shooting potential, and if he realizes both of those things, I think he's going to end up being a very, very good player. My number 2 guy, rounding out the first tier, is James Wiseman. This tier is pretty much guys that I think are probably going to make an all-star team at some point in their career, and I'm a big believer in Wiseman. I think he's probably the safest bet of anyone in this draft. He's got a high ceiling and a high floor. I don't think his ceiling is as high as LaMelo's, and that's the reason why I have him number 2, but I do think that there is potential for him to become one of the best defensive centers in the NBA, while also being a solid rim runner and hopefully at some point a pick-and-pop guy. So with James Wiseman, I'm buying into him, and I think that he is probably the biggest guarantee to go in the top 2 picks of this upcoming draft. The next 3 guys are all in tier 2, and that's tier of guys that I think are going to be probably above average starters in the NBA and could possibly be all-star level guys at some point, but just a step below the top 2 guys. And at number 3, I have the third consensus top 3 guy in this draft, and a guy who a lot of people would probably put in tier 1, and that's Anthony Edwards. I'm not as high on Anthony Edwards than a lot of people are due to my questions about his motor. I think that's really important, and Anthony on defense, there's so many questions about how locked in he's going to be when he is locked in. Like, I've watched a few possessions of him where I'm like, yeah, this guy could be an all-defense team caliber talent due to his stellar on-the-ball play. But off the ball, he tends to get lost, and those on-the-ball moments are few and far between. His offensive game, there's questions too. Like, he hasn't shot the ball great. His shot selection is questionable. He settles too much and doesn't use his strong body to get to the rim as much as I would like. So there's enough questions that I dropped Anthony Edwards from tier 1 to tier 2. But his potential is probably higher than anyone else in this draft. I just think that his floor is significantly lower than Ball and Wiseman's. Fourth guy on my big board is Deni Avdija. I'm a big believer in Danny. I think that the skill set that he can bring as a playmaking wing is very, very valuable, especially to a lot of teams in this part of the draft that have guards that prefer to score, such as the Bulls and the Cavaliers. The defense is solid. He's a pretty good team defender. His on the ball stuff isn't terrific, and he's not ever going to be an all defense level guy, but he is at least going to be a league average defender almost off the bat. And on the offensive end, his ability as a playmaker is huge. The shot is the question mark, but it looks good enough that I am going to tend to believe in it. My next choice would be, or not my next choice. I'm so used to those in-depth boards for individual teams, but the fifth guy on my board in rounding out tier 2 is Onyeka Okongwu from USC. I think that Onyeka will definitely be a starting center in the NBA for a while during his career. He is he's a different kind of defensive center than Wiseman. Okongwu will fit a scheme that's going to be more switch heavy, and he can probably guard on the perimeter just as well as any other big guy in this draft, with the possible exception of Precious Achiuwa. However, on the offensive end, he also has some potential to become a shooter, which could be interesting as a pick and pop guy. He doesn't have the rim protection ability of a guy like James Wiseman, but overall, I think that he's definitely the second best big guy in this draft, and I do think that he's going to be an above average starting center in the NBA, and that's why I have him fifth on my big board. Kicking off tier 3, which is guys that I think are probably going to end up being solid starters, is Killian Hayes at number 6. I had Killian as high as number 3 on my board at one point. However, with the struggles of some smaller guards during the playoffs, it dropped him down a bit. I think that he's going to be maybe one of the higher chances of becoming an all-star, but I also think that there's a very real chance that he's just a bench guy. He's very skilled, dribbles the ball very well, especially with his left hand. He's a solid playmaker. The shot is very good from free throws, but we haven't seen that translate to live action, as his 3-point percentage and 2-point percentage aren't as high as you would quite like. He is a little over-reliant on that left hand, but I believe in Killian enough to have him above the next guy in Tyrese Halliburton from Iowa State. Halliburton is kind of the opposite of Hayes, where I think that Halliburton has a higher floor but a lower ceiling when compared to his French counterpart. Tyrese is an excellent catch-and-shoot guy. There's questions of what his shot off the dribble and whether or not he can do it off of movement too much, but I do think that in the end his potential to play on the ball and be a playmaker and secondary ball handler, as well as a solid defender, is going to make him pretty valuable, and I think that his range is probably anywhere from like 4 until 10. My next choice would be Devin Vassell from Florida State. Not my next choice, keep saying that, but number 8 on my big board would be Devin Vassell. Vassell is one of the highest floor players in the entire NBA. Great catch and shoot guy, solid defender. You know what you're getting with him, as I think that he is one of the highest floors in this entire draft, and maybe is the biggest sure thing in the whole draft, as a guy that's going to be a rotation contributor, very similar to what we've seen from Danny Green on championship teams the past 2 years. His player type is very valuable to good teams, and I see Devin as a surefire top 10 pick. At number 9, I have Isaac Okoro from Auburn. This is kind of the opposite scenario that we saw with Hayes and Halliburton, as instead of having the higher upside, lower floor guy above the high floor, low ceiling guy, in this case with these two wings in Vassell and Okoro, I have the high floor guy above the high ceiling guy with putting Vassell over Okoro. Okoro could develop into a fantastic NBA player if the jump shot develops, but I have enough questions there that I have him at 9th on my board instead of, say, 6th. Rounding out tier 3 is a guy that, honestly, I could put all the way up at 6. I just don't quite have the balls to do it. But Tyrese Maxey is one of my favorite guys in this draft. I believe in him very, very much so compared to what most people do, and I think that he is going to become a fantastic player in the NBA. Starter for certain as a combo guard who can play good defense and at some point will be able to shoot the ball pretty well and is strong enough to be very valuable as a guy who can attack the rim. Starting tier 4, which is guys that are either going to be 4th or 5th starters or early guys off the bench, is Saddiq Bey for me. Bey is going to be a very valuable third wing and tertiary playmaker at some point in his NBA career. He can shoot the ball well. He's a good defender, has the defensive versatility to guard 1 through 4. There's just enough questions with him about his athleticism that I'm not comfortable putting him in my top 10 and not comfortable putting him in tier 3, but I do think that he's going to end up being a rotational piece. At number 12, we have Patrick Williams, who's one of the bigger home run swings guys at this part of the draft. His defensive potential is massive, but his offensive game is raw, and if you can develop that offensive game, you could be getting the steal of the draft. At 13 on my big board is Obi Toppin from Dayton. Toppin is a top 5 guy for a lot of people. Even some people have him in their top 3, but I have so many questions about his hip flexibility, his post defense, the defense in general, really. I just don't think that it's going to work out with him, and he's going to be a liability that you can't really have on the court during closing minutes of playoff games. At number 14 on my big board, I have Kira Lewis from Alabama. Kira is a guy that I really like, and I would love to have him higher on this board, but he's just so small, and that brings a lot of questions to my mind. We could see him end up being maybe like Ish Smith as a bench player. Maybe it's Isaiah Thomas. Not 29 points per game season Isaiah Thomas, but like average starting point guard Isaiah Thomas. I think Kira is probably a better defender than Isaiah, but he's very, very small. And that brings enough questions to my mind that I can't buy into the allure of Kira Lewis. Although I do think he's a fantastic player, and maybe he ends up being... No. I was going to say maybe he ends up being the best player in the G League for a long time, but he will be an NBA guy. Just I don't think I buy him as a starter. So I think he'll end up being a very good backup point guard. Maybe Monte Morris. And if you're Monte Morris, that's a solid NBA player. At number 15, I have RJ Hampton, who played with the New Zealand Breakers over in Australia this past season, the NBL. RJ Hampton, one of the more controversial prospects in this upcoming draft, because I've seen some people, such as Sam Vecini, that have him all the way up in their top 10, and others that have him outside of their top 25. There's a lot of different ways his career could go. Maybe he hits on his athleticism, he makes improvement on his shooting, and he ends up being an above-average starter as a combo guard. Otherwise, he could be a bust and out of the NBA by the end of his rookie contract. I tend to be somewhere in between, and I think he'll end up being a good scorer off the bench, but I don't see him being all that much more than that, and that is why I have him here in Tier 4. Kicking off Tier 5 at number 16 is a guy who has been rising throughout the pre-draft process, and for me, I have him moving all the way into my top 20 here at 16, and that is Desmond Bane from TCU. Bane can shoot it. He's a good defender. He's very strong, and I think that could translate into him becoming a better guy attacking the rim than he has been. He could be the sleeper of the draft, and if I had any pick in the 20 to 25 range, I would certainly consider him one of my primary targets. At 17, I have Aaron Nesmith from Vanderbilt. Some people view Nesmith as a top 12 guy. I'm not quite there. I have too many questions about his game outside the jump shot that he's fallen all the way to 17 for me when I actually had him as a lottery guy at some point. At 18, I have Precious Achiuwa from Memphis. Defensive terror, but there's questions about his offensive decision-making, and I don't know if the defense will translate immediately, so I don't have him. I have a lot of trouble putting him much higher than the 15 to 20 range. At 19, I have Alexei Pokusevski just as a shot in the dark for some team that thinks they can develop him. He's so skinny, and he was playing against such terrible competition. However, you can see that there's a lot of potential there. Is just a lanky 7-foot guy who can dribble and shoot, but there's a huge chance that this just becomes a waste of a pick, and I think that's the most likely scenario. But if you do have that 10% chance of finding a guy who can be an incredible contributor for you, I'm okay with you taking that shot anywhere from 15 to 25. Malachi Flynn is my 20th guy on my big board. I'm a big Malachi believer, and I'd like to have him even higher than this. Honestly, I would put him in a similar ballpark to Kira Lewis and RJ Hampton almost, but I buy Malachi as a guy who's going to be a plus defender in the NBA, can shoot the ball, can handle the ball, can be a playmaker for you. At the very least, I think he's going to be one of the better backup point guards in the NBA, and at the very most, I could see him being like a Ricky Rubio type, above average court commander for you who can really bring a lot of valuable traits to your team. And I think that he's one of the biggest sleepers in the draft, similar to Desmond Bane, and I think that anywhere in the 20 to 30 range could be a very nice value grab for pretty much any contender. At 21, I have Trey Jones from Duke. He was the ACC Defensive Player of the Year and the ACC Player of the Year overall this past season, and I don't think that he'll be that successful in the NBA, but I do think that similar to Malachi Flynn, he's going to end up being either an above average or a very good backup point guard, or a slightly below average to maybe even an average starting point guard. I tend to believe in Malachi a bit more just because, from what I've heard, Malachi's a complete gamer and he's locked himself in to become the next Fred VanVleet. But Trey Jones has an excellent chance to become a NBA player as well. Like a rotational NBA player. Tyrell Terry is 22 for me. Tyrell is a guy who can shoot the ball. He's put on a lot of weight and gotten much stronger during the course of the pre-draft process. He's 6'1" though, and I don't think that he has the skills of Kira Lewis. And like I said before, I have questions about Lewis's size. So, despite Terry being as strong as he is, I don't quite see him becoming much more than a spark plug off the bench who can shoot the lights out. Kicking off Tier 6 is a guy who has really fallen from grace recently. Not even recently. Like, going into the season, people had him as a top 5 pick, and I have him all the way down here at 23. And that's Cole Anthony from North Carolina. Cole really struggled at North Carolina as he didn't have much shooting surrounding him. And I just can't buy it. I have lots of questions about his shot selection, lots of questions about his defense, and I think he ends up being a pretty big bust if he ends up going in the lottery, and maybe he can just become a bench player. At 24, I have one of my favorite guys in this draft, Zeke Nnaji from Arizona. I was very tempted to put Zeke up in Tier 5, but I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. But I do think that at some point he is going to end up being a stretch 4. I've heard good things about his jump shot, and if he can improve that jump shot and get it to the point that it needs to be at for him to be a consistent NBA contributor, watch out, because he can move his feet very well for a big guy, and he's going to be able to guard multiple positions on defense. So if he can stretch the floor, I think this can be a very valuable role player at some point. Isaiah Stewart is another guy who could develop into a shooter. However, his inability on defense to switch on to smaller players is what has him below Nnaji, in my opinion. But 25th on the big board, there's a good chance that he still goes in the first round. And I think that whoever drafts him will be picking up a guy that can be a solid backup center for the entirety of his career, and maybe a below average starting center at some point as well. At 26, I have Jalen Stick Smith from Maryland. I think in my mock draft, I had him going at like 18 or 19 or something like that. And the fact that he's this low on my big board and that high in my mock draft makes me think, or indicates that I think that he's going to be one of the guys that goes higher than he should. I have questions about him on defense due to how skinny he is. He needs to put on some weight. I don't think that he's as great of a rim protector as some people do. And I think that drafting him in the top 20 would be a mistake, and I would rather see him go at the bottom of the first round. At number 27, I have Josh Green from Arizona, a guy that's going to end up being a third or fourth wing on a team who can come off the bench and play solid defense. Not a great jump shooter, but if it can develop, he can be a solid 3-and-D guy and maybe a fifth starter on a good team. At 28, I have Robert Woodard, defense first kind of player. If the jump shot comes along, then he can end up being a solid, like I said with Josh Green, solid third wing, option off the bench, maybe could start at some point, but as of now, I'd say it's more likely that he's a bench guy who can, give you some good things off the bench. Sam Merrill is 29 for me on my big board. That's much higher than a lot of people have him, but I think that he's going to end up being a point guard in the NBA. And with his shooting ability, both off of the catch and shoot, off of the bounce, off of movement, I think that translates very well to the NBA, and I think he ends up being a solid shooter off the bench for a good team at some point. And finally, at number 30, I have Grant Riller. His ceiling is probably Lou Williams. He's a guy who can come off the bench and just be a straight-up bucket, but there's also a chance that he ends up being a very good G League player and not even be an NBA guy at all. Maybe this is the next dominant overseas guy, but I don't really buy him as an NBA starter, but maybe he can become a solid sixth man at some point. That was my big board, my top 30 guys in this draft. Let me know in the comment section down below what you think. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Leave a like and subscribe. That's it for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I will see you all again very soon.